Welcome to Influential Visions podcast. Here, we interview futuristic leaders who share their deep industry knowledge and business experience with you, ensuring you have your finger on the pulse and your eyes wide open.
My name is Nat Schooler. I am privileged to be joined by Kim Adele again, who is co-hosting this series here with us on imposter syndrome. And Scott Francis is with us as well, and he's the CEO and co-founder of BP3, where their mission is to help clients find a faster way to their business outcomes using technology, I would imagine.
Yes, that's right.
Welcome.
That's right. We're all about intelligent automation, process automation. The theme of getting things done faster kind of pervades everything we do, but so does process, right? So we're very much process geeks, and we always, you go to a restaurant and the queue isn't really set up the right way, and it drives you nuts. That's our team, right? So we can't go to lunch any place that has a queue. It drives us crazy, right? We're like, it's not really organized right, and anyway.
Very much step in and help them.
Yeah, I mean, it very much becomes part of your culture, right? When you focus on a problem, everything looks like a process problem to us. And good news is mostly it is. So
it's an interesting world, isn't it, when it comes to that? Because it's usually a people problem and then a problem with the technology, right? That's what I've been learning, from my studies into this. And it's very, very interesting. But kind of along the way, you must have had all sorts of, maybe feelings of not being good enough to do your job, right? Like, were there any sort of turning points that you'd like to sort of talk about?
Well, I think there are several, things that I would kind of identify. I was not obviously introverted, right? I think, my friends growing up wouldn't necessarily describe me that way. But certainly, when I got sent to my room, that was like the best punishment ever, right? Okay, read a book. I can build things with Legos. Like I don't actually need social interaction to be happy, right? And alone time is a fantastic thing, and it always has been. And when I was in high school, kind of the first turning point for me was when one of my teachers, sort of drafted me into the debate team, and almost forced me to do it, right? She talked to my parents, and the pressure built, right? And so I took that on, and it taught me that I could speak in public, right, if I had to, and it was something you could practice and get better at. But boy, the first couple times you stand up, you're sweating, and if you didn't have a uniform on, right, you put a suit on, and And for a long time, I couldn't speak in public unless I, kind of put the uniform on, right? A jacket and tie, and, and it was like two personas, your normal self. And then, okay, if I have to present, I need to, kind of put my uniform on and do it. And then in college, I majored in computer science, which is not the most social subject, our computer science folks, the joke is sort of, if we're not social, then we go build social networks, right? So we can be social online rather than in person. It's fair. It's a fair criticism. I enjoyed staying up all night working on coding solutions and things like that. And I kind of saw my career path developing as a software developer and just doing that, right? I love the problems. I love solving hard problems and working on them. And, again, didn't really miss the social interaction while I was doing that. And, and most of my friends were not computer scientists along the way in college because, frankly, we're not the most social bunch, by default. And mostly you're working on your assignments, not socializing together. And so I got to meet other people in the dorm, different interests, different things like that. But when I took my first job out of college, I had another turning point, which is, they were doing really interesting work around configuration. It's kind of, at the time, in the 90s, it was a real interesting AI topic, right? Heuristic search, backchain, backchaining and constraint satisfaction, resource pooling. Like, they were using a bunch of techniques in order to configure complex products like telephone switches, PBXs, Boeing 737s, simple stuff like that. And if you get it wrong, right, there are two consequences. One is if they built it the way you did it, and you got it wrong, then bad things could happen. Planes don't fly or whatever. But the other is they'll get the price wrong, and it will cost the customers a lot of money. But what they asked me to do is go out to a client and build the solution for them, and which was horrifying, right? Because I didn't really know the software. I certainly didn't know how to be a consultant or present to a client and tell them about what we're doing. I didn't have any training in that whatsoever. And the company I was at, Trilogy, we didn't at the time do any training, right? We just threw people out there and said, good luck, right? Like, here's your laptop that you've had for 20 minutes. It was certainly, nerve-wracking, right? And there was definite imposter syndrome. And the only saving grace was that I knew my customer knew even less about configuration and our software than I did. I was like one day ahead of them. So there was that. But that being put on site with a client, did act as a turning point for me, because it changed my professional career trajectory. I could have very easily stayed in the development world and been happy doing that. But what it exposed to me was how much I enjoyed helping people solve their problems, and how much gratification there was out of that I wasn't getting when I was writing code at just for myself or for some unnamed or faceless, consumer of that software. And in particular, we're writing software to help them do sales quotations of voicemail systems at this customer, an old company called Centigram. And they had their big sales kickoff at the end, about 3 months in, and they wanted to demonstrate what we'd built that would allow them to do a quote of a complex custom engineered product in about 5 minutes instead of a week. Okay. And, that seems cool, right? But I have no idea what I've never talked to any of their sales team folks. I have no idea what, and, by today's standards, you think if you're building software for them, how could you not first talk to them? But, it's kind of like Office Space, right? There were people to do that, right? The people person who talks to the customers and talks to the engineers and tells you what they want. And so, we built what we thought they wanted, and we went into this situation that the project manager demoed it for them rather than me, which was another good learning, that let your client demo your software, right? It's a beautiful thing when they do, because they're taking ownership over what you've built. And, for a customer, that's a big deal for them. And it's not about you, right? It's about them. And so as a kind of an introvert anyway, that was very nice for me. I could sit in the back. But the thing that was crazy is the demo didn't work until about 10 minutes before he went on stage. I had broken something the night before, probably because I stayed up too late, trying to do one too many bells and whistles. Should have just stopped, right? So I was frantically fixing things as we're waiting for them to introduce him on stage. He goes up and does the demo flawlessly. And then I got a standing ovation from the sales team. He did, but also he points me out in the back, and they turn around and they're giving me the ovation. And then they wanted to buy me drinks at the bar afterward. We're at a hotel ballroom. And, that really changed my outlook on, well, what is this consulting life like? Now, I have to admit, I haven't gotten too many standing ovations in my career. No matter what you do, that's an unusual outcome, but it sure set me off on a different path.
I love it. What an amazing journey you've already had. And thank you so much for sharing with us your turning points. And I loved the fact that it so resonated with me from my own, that almost having to have a uniform where, you've got as long as you've got the right clothes on, that you can probably just convince yourself that you can get through it. Have you found over the years that there's been other things like that you still use in moments where you're feeling doubt or uncertain?
Yeah, I think it helps to have some, if you will, armor, right, that you can put on when it's time to perform. And for me, it's a little bit of ritual, right? Like good cup of coffee beforehand, right? And or just kind of getting a little amped up before, if I have to present or be on stage or even be with you guys. Like, it's cold outside, so it's easy, right? Just walk outside, take a quick walk around, something just to kind of get the energy level up. And I think that still works today. I think that I'm less worried about sort of physical appearance, like I don't have to wear the right clothes or wear a jacket or whatnot. But but I think still those things help, right? When you do go that extra mile, right? You do put the jacket on and the tie and that sort of thing. It puts you in a different mode, right? You feel sharp, and it affects your posture and how you present.
That's very interesting. Very interesting, because
I think for anyone who's shy, right?
Pardon?
Yeah. I was going to say, anyone who's shy, or it's very uncomfortable, I think it's really helpful to have both a little bit of ritual and, something you wear that makes you feel like you're going to look good and and then feel strong when you go up there.
Very much so. There's also this lady called Amy Cuddy, I think her name is, and she talks about how you basically raise your testosterone and lower your cortisol, right? And like, she gives this TED talk. I don't think she went to Stanford, because I know you went to Stanford, right? And so, your history of where you sort of started is already on a sort of pedigree, right? But like Amy Cuddy, she basically talks about how people stand there in this power pose, and they'll stand there in the mirror or maybe put their feet on their desk or whatever, right? And they basically psych themselves up to present or do whatever they're going to do. And she actually ran some tests in a closed environment around this, and it turned out that everybody that sat there and had this big wide open posture and they psyched themselves up got the fake job that they applied for. But everybody else sat there and looked down like this and made themselves very small and looked at their mobile phones, right? And they actually didn't get offered the job, the fake job, right? So that just confirms the kind of how you can kind of deal with these endorphins and hormones and whatever.
Well, and in particular, if the advice is too generalized, right? You gave a really specific point that I think anyone could learn from, which is put your cell phone down. Quit reading your Twitter, your Slack messages, your email. Like, set that stuff aside for a few minutes. Even if you talk to somebody else, it may be distracting talking to that person, but that's a much better use of your prep time than focusing on a device, right? Or notifications, things like that, because it brings your focus inward in an unproductive way.
Yeah,
and you need to be focusing outward.
Absolutely. And also in your story, Scott, you mentioned a couple of occasions where you could say you perhaps got pushed or thrown into things, or perhaps you could say that those people believed in you and you had to borrow their belief. And in doing so, learned something. And I know you now do so much to help mentor and support other people. Have you found lending them your belief has helped?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, we run a consulting business, and so I cannot micromanage what everybody does, right, out in the field. And so just by definition, and I experienced that as a consultant, they send you out, we refer to it as being on an island, right? Like, they send you out to a client to help them, and you're on an island, and you better make it work, right? And you have to figure it out, and there's nobody with you potentially. If you're lucky, you have a team member, a team of 4 people, 20 people, whatever it is. But if you're at a small firm, a lot of times you're on your own. And, so that's, something we talk about whenever we hire folks out of college or hire people that haven't done consulting before. One of the things we talk about is imposter syndrome. And, we have some quotes from famous, comedians and, Tina Fey and stuff like that, about imposter syndrome and how they felt before they, sort of made it. And then, okay, now you've made it, right? Surely it gets better. And it gets worse, right? Because you feel like you have bigger expectations to live up to. And, and so we talked about that with the consultants, and they're all like convinced initially, not all, I'd say at least half of the folks I talked to when we hired them are convinced that they're going to be okay and they won't experience a lot of imposter syndrome. And then the first time we ask them to present in our own company, right, it's a lot of flustered, it's just hard, right? Because those folks in the room know more than you do, and they're asking you to present on something. You're going to get something wrong. You're going to be judged. All those insecurities sort of pile up all of a sudden, and in a way that maybe they weren't expecting until the moment arrives, right? And then the other set of people are like, oh yeah, I'm experiencing that now. And I just experienced that in college. Like, still kind of surprised I graduated. People have that sort of, oh my God, like, I made it. I got a job. I'm like, now what? It's all across that spectrum. But I think it's important to talk about, because we send them out and they've got to perform. And I know that first week is the highest risk part of their engagement, right? So what we try to do is prep them a little bit, for the mentality, right? Just kind of have their head together. Over the last year, of course, we haven't been traveling to customer sites. It's been on, Zoom calls and things like that. Instead, the silver lining on that is that, they're not as on an island as they would be, right? We can always have somebody with them on that call to kind of ease that in. They don't have to figure out the hotels and the restaurants and the planes, trains, and automobiles on their own. But pre-COVID, right, it was a bit more like up in the air. That movie where like, can you pick which line is going to be faster based on who's in line? And you get to be a jaded traveler. And you don't travel on holidays because it's amateur hour, right? Like all the people who don't normally travel are traveling and clogging up the lines. So it just changes your whole way of thinking about things. And so for those consultants, there are a few things we're trying to get them prepped ahead of time, tell them, they've got to expect it, but they still have to present confidence even if they don't feel it. And then we also talk about getting them help, right? So we have a team here in Austin that supports all of our consultants in the field. And in fact, they also support our clients. So our clients can buy the same support our consultants get in the field. And basically you run into a problem, you file a ticket, call them on the phone, hit them on Zoom, and they will help you, right? And then it's not like, oh, that's not my job, I don't know how to do that. Let me get in there and help you. And they're engineers and they're support engineers, and they're fantastic, right? So that's something that we did differently at BP3, because every previous place I worked, when you were out in the field, you were truly on your own, and there was nobody to call for support unless it was a product issue. Then you could call product support. But the minute it was outside the boundaries of what that product does, or they could say it was, right? Oh, sorry, as designed, working as designed, no plan to implement that feature request or that bug, right? So, you were on your own, figure it out. So I think for us, it's getting people that kind of apprenticeship, right? So one part is getting them prepped, but the other part is pairing them with somebody who's been through it, right? So you pair new with old, right? Like your newest hires with your more experienced hires. You give them that experience kind of one-on-one, ideally a two-person project. Then you get them into a bigger project where there are more people. Then if you're lucky, you get them a chance to work on their own on something. And then maybe in something where they take the lead and their partner may be more experienced than they are, right? The person in the sidecar may be part-time on the project or for whatever reason, not the lead because they weren't introduced first, but you get them the experience of having someone behind you who's helping you figure out how to lead, right? And it's different when you're suddenly in the chair, right? Certainly my experience, the first time I had to lead a project, it was one thing doing it on my own. The first time I had to lead a project was really kind of scary, right? I didn't have any training to do that either. And so I know kind of how it feels, and having that person next to you who's done it before and can say, okay, so now you should really write down what are all the things we have to do to get to production, right? Oh, that's a good idea, right? You write all those down.
I love that. Yeah. What you're doing though is making it open to talk about, creating an environment where actually you let them know it's okay, because we all feel like this, and it's imposter syndrome, we know it hits probably 70% of us at some point in our life, and the challenge is you can't tell anybody because you're currently feeling like an imposter, and heaven forbid anybody knows. So I think the work that you're doing to actually tell them it's okay, you're going to feel like this, we all feel like this, really demonstrates that art of leadership around sharing your vulnerability without losing your credibility to create that safe space. And that must have a massive impact on your people and your retention of those, I imagine.
Yeah, well, I think we've been very fortunate to have really good retention with our team, our executive team, and the rest of our team. It's really, we have a great team, and people like working together, and that spirit of helping each other has a huge impact on that. And at the same time, I think that, in my shoes, I think there are times, right, sort of as I'm talking, it might sound like I've got it figured out. And I would say, well, I don't, right? I'm figuring it out on a regular basis. And there are times when, our company has struggled, and I know we're struggling. The team knows we're struggling. Like, inside the company, we know we're struggling, but outside, maybe people don't. And so they just think you're walking on water and kicking butt, taking names. And it's like, well, no, actually, yeah, it's really hard right now. And it's hard to lead people when you're struggling too, because they kind of, you feel like they surely must be questioning every decision we make right now, or wondering if we know what we're talking about or what we're doing. And so I think even when you're the CEO, even when it seems obvious that you know what you're doing or that you know how to run the company, there are times when you don't, or you hit a pivot point where you don't feel like you know the answers. And there are times when you feel like, well, I might have thought I knew the answers, but things aren't going well.
Yeah.
Now what, right? And so that feeling of imposter syndrome, like, am I in the right chair? Should somebody else sit in this chair and maybe pilot for a while, right? Those feelings come back, I think, periodically. And I know at my stage they do. I kind of think, there's Fortune 500 CEOs and stuff like that. I mean, it must hit them a lot harder than it hits people who are, running smaller businesses, right? It's got to be kind of overwhelming at times when a company's struggling and your levers of changing how it operates are so much more removed from the people on the front lines than, say, 150 person consulting company, right?
Yeah, but I think the impact is still the same, isn't it? Because you're concerned about the people that work for you, about their livelihoods, their families, their lives. And I think sometimes we can look at it and go, well, mine must be very different. We almost have an imposter about how big our imposter is, don't we? Because it's like, my imposter can't be as good as their imposter, because they're like so much bigger. But the reality is at those moments, it's that feeling of not being good enough, of not being what's needed to be able to do this part. And as the as a CEO, it's very difficult, isn't it? Because where do you go for support? You can't really tell the board, because they might lose some faith in you, and you can't tell your people because they really want to know that you're okay, that they follow you and they've got the lead. So I guess that's where people go and try and find people like me or others, where it's like, I need somebody to just sound this off against, that is a confidant or something. Is that something that you suggest people do, when within your company or other people around that
Yeah, absolutely. And I've tried for some of our team members, try to find folks outside our company who might have a good rapport, who do the same kind of job but maybe a little further along in their career. We've done that in marketing, for example, or engineering leadership. Because there are people who really, they're quite gratified to help someone else, right? And it's nice for them, if you're the CMO of some public company or whatever, it's nice to have a break from thinking about those issues to talk to somebody about their smaller, issues, like, oh, this is kind of refreshing, or helping someone earlier in their career. And it's not someone who's then going to turn around and ask for a raise, right? Because they work for some other company, right? So, it's the pressure's off in a way, and I think they really enjoy it. I think if you're the CEO, it's a little more challenging to find that confidant if you don't have a good circle of friends or confidants that you can have those conversations with, that you've kind of kept along the years. And I think a lot of founders of companies and CEOs have kind of lost those friendships, not out of any leaving bodies behind or whatever, but just because they haven't invested the time in those friends, right? And they focus so much on building a business and they built professional friendships, right? Not to say they don't have friends, but professional friendships, but not necessarily the folks they can really confide in at a personal level, or who would they, if you had to pick one person to go have a drink with, who would it be? And if it's somebody at work, then you know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah. And I think it's just really important to find folks you can talk to, whether it's your spouse, which again has some other pressures, right? If your partner in life is stressed about money, talking to them about your stresses about work may not be helpful, right? So, you have to really maybe experiment and try that and see how it works.
Yeah, experiment.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a hypothesis to test. Will my partner be a good support person for me to work out my angst with, or will they make it worse, right? If they make it worse, just stop doing it, right? Like, don't go to them with that. And that doesn't mean they're a bad partner or spouse, and doesn't make you a bad partner or spouse. It just means you need a different ear or sounding board, and it's okay to have more than one, right? I'm fortunate that my wife runs her own business, in events business, and so she's always been someone that I could go to. and vice versa, right? We lean on each other a lot for help and advice. But even so, right, there's a limit. There are times when, we really should go to other people, right, to get a different perspective so that there isn't as much of the personal in the conversation, right? Kind of, get some other perspective. And, I found going back and talking to folks that I worked with years ago that I was very close with, in a previous job. And now we've moved on, right? And they're executives in their own right. And some of those folks are people that they're like a year or two older than me, but they seem more experienced, right? Because when I met them, they were a year or two older, or 3 years or whatever, right? And they seem really old. And I'm much older than they were when I met them, but they still seem like people I can lean on and talk to, and they'll take time to listen and give me their opinion and feedback. And we just care about each other enough to talk through it. I think everybody kind of needs that. And ironically, it's not. I guess I would say one more thing is, don't expect it to be sort of bilateral, right? Like I go to them and they'll come to me. I find it tends to be pretty unilateral. Like, you go to somebody and they're going to somebody else. And, except maybe with your partner, right? My wife and I, we certainly go to each other. But outside of that, it tends to be more unilateral, right? And I think maybe that makes sense, right? But, but my advice would just be, don't worry about trying to make it fair, right? If they're willing to help, that is the reward, right? Like if they're investing the time in you and they care about you, that's the gratification that they really are looking for, that I am when I'm helping folks. And I'm not really looking for payback. And I eventually came to the conclusion that they aren't either. Took a while to figure that out. It's a bit like friendship, right? You don't keep score, like who bought the last burrito, who's buying the next one. You just, you get together and spend time together, and that's its own reward. Right?
That's very interesting. So you mentioned something about, I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, but you mentioned something about being on the board of trustees of a school. I think it's called, is it Magellan? Yeah. I'm not quite sure. I probably pronounced it wrong.
Here in Austin, we pronounce it Magellan, but it's the, and it named after the explorer, right? And so the pronunciation of his name depends on where you live, right? The Spanish pronunciation is different again. And the school is an international school. In Austin, it's the not-for-profit school. And, it starts out by doing immersion Spanish. They layer in Mandarin starting in 3rd grade. And so, you kind of come out of school speaking 3 languages fluently and reading in 3 languages at an elementary level in Mandarin, but in a pretty advanced level in Spanish and English. And of course, they cover all the other fun stuff, right? There's design thinking classes and math and history and all that jazz, humanities. And so it's kind of an amazing school in Austin. And Austin has, in the 25 or 6 years that I've been here, has been becoming a more international city over that time, right? I can fly direct to London. Pre-pandemic, the number of direct flights was just, expanding rapidly, and they were opening flights to Frankfurt and Amsterdam and London, and it's kind of crazy, how much Austin has changed over the years and how much easier it is to do international business from Austin than it used to be. And that's part of the appeal of Magellan, is to build, kids into people who are ready to exist in that more global context. And I was asked to join the board, 7 or 8 years ago, and being on the board is sort of fine, right? Again, you're not really put out front and center, but at some point, they asked me to be the chair, and which is an honor, but it's a bit like, I worked at BP3 as CTO for many years before becoming CEO, and that shift seems like not a huge change, but it is, in terms of certainly the sense of imposter syndrome, right? The first time you have to get up in front of a bunch of parents and explain what you're doing that year, why tuition went up, things like that. Like those are, interesting conversations. Or when they have questions about the math curriculum. And now there are people who work at the school who answer those questions, but they also, in the early stages of a school, they look to the board for accountability, right? And to say, like, if they're not happy with the administration's answers, then they look at you and they go, well, what are you going to do about it? I'm going to help make sure the school has the resources they need to pursue the right answers, right? And early on in a school, you don't have the test scores to prove that you're doing the right things, right? Like it takes a little while to build the track record, right? Even if you have a test, it's only a test, right? One day, 1 year, right? So it takes time to build the history. Now we have all that track record, and anyone who wants to complain about how the math curriculum works, I said, well, if you look at the scores we're putting up, right, they're more than our median is more than a standard deviation higher than the median across all the kids who take the test. So maybe that's not good enough for you, and I get it, but where's the better place, right? There's a lot of great information now to support us, but getting up in front of parents in an area that wasn't my specialty, and it's more emotional, right, to me. Like I can barely get in front of the school and talk to them without tearing up, because it is an emotional thing for me, whereas work is more professional. It can get emotional, but school, like the whole reason I'm involved is because I care so much about what they're doing for my kids and what it means for us, and how they've helped our kids really blossom, right, and turn into these kind of amazing creatures that I'm not entirely convinced are related to me, because they're way smarter and cooler than I was at the same age. And you just want to make it work for other people, right, and give that experience back. And I would say that as hard as that was to do, and I certainly made a few mistakes along the way, right, in public speaking, fumbling words or being misunderstood, right. I know what I said, but it wasn't understood the way I meant it, or the way, or even the words replayed back to me were not the words I actually said, right. You have those issues when you do public speaking, and when your audience is as emotionally involved as you are. And I think that is something I wasn't prepared for, is that our employees are professionally emotionally involved. I'm professionally emotionally involved at BP3. At Magellan, parents are, my children are in the school emotionally involved, right? And so am I. So the emotional content of every conversation is actually much higher than the informational content. And at work, I feel like it's the other, it's the inverse, right? The informational content is really important, and the emotional content helps, but it's not the most important part, right? And that took some real adaptation to get used to and figure out how to navigate that. And then to just eventually I just decided to be okay with the fact that I was going to be emotional. And it's, I think, kind of a running joke at school that they can't put me up in front of everybody without me getting emotional. So I try not to make contact with anyone else in the audience who will get teary-eyed, because then I'll like lock eyes and now I'm going to cry, right? So we have to avoid that. But the thing that working with Magellan really taught me as a CEO was how to spend more time coaching and less time telling people what to do, right, or what I thought they should do. And it's a subtle difference, right, because you can kind of say, hey, I think we should do X. That might, to me, sound like coaching. To the person I'm talking to, it sure sounds like I better do that, right? And so you have to kind of work on your use of words and how you reassure them that you're coaching them. And you say, what, like, instead of telling them what you think they ought to do, right, you ask them what they think they ought to do. And in the milieu of education, where, I have family in education who are professors and teachers and librarians, and, so I've got lots of family context, but I haven't run a school, right? And I don't know how to do the job. I don't know how to teach the class. And so sometimes I would run across really tricky situations, and I had an opinion, but I had to, swallow my opinion and ask the question, what do you guys want to do, right? Or what support do you want from me to help you in this moment, right? Because I want to be clear on what you're asking, right? Or what you're looking for. And sometimes the advice that they gave was like magic, like the way to handle a really tough situation with a parent, or the way to handle a tough educational situation. They have the expertise, right? And what they needed for me was to know that I had their back, right? That's really what they needed, right? And so all of my conversations at school tended to be framed around, look, as the board, right? For example, I'd have to help them understand my thought process is safety in the classroom, right? For your students and for the teacher. So that's important for, like, our need to support the safety and the education of one student is really important, but not at the expense of every other student or the teacher in that classroom, for example, right? So So how do we balance those? And then somebody would have an opinion about, okay, well, here's my thought about how to handle that. I'm like, okay, well, like I've got your back, right? If you need it, and just expressing how you can do that and voice that support. And it gave me insight into what I wasn't doing at BP3, and how much more I needed to back off of telling people what I thought they should do, or telling them what I wanted them to do, and more express those things in more questions, right? Like, what should we do? And what would you do if you were me, or whatever, right? You have different ways of drawing it out, and usually they have really good answers. And some of those answers are better than the answer I would have given them. Probably a lot of those answers are better than the answer I would have given them. And it has the benefit of they're committed to the answer, right? Like, they believe it's the right thing to do. So if you support them, like, you've done two things. You've let them pursue the best answer, and pursue the answer they're really motivated to pursue. And they feel like you trust them because you do. And you've demonstrated that, not just said it, but demonstrated it. And then, finally, they have a better sense for how to make that decision without you if you're not available next time, right? Like, they're learning from you how you think through it by asking the questions. So
that real ability to listen to them, to understand rather than to interject. And I think that's probably one of the skills a lot of leaders have needed to practice, because they've spent a lot of years listening long enough to give the answer rather than listening to understand the other person's viewpoint and to build that in. Imposter syndrome affects 70% of us at some point. If this is affecting you, click the link to get help. It's been such an insightful interview already. You've shared so much, Scott. But can I ask you, if there were one thing that you've learned now that you wish you'd learned years ago, or that you do whenever you're in an imposter is trying to take control, what would it be?
Yeah, I think a key thing when I feel that, I wish if I could have gone back, right, in time, and kind of, those moments when I really had a lot of fear, and feeling that kind of imposter syndrome. I certainly lost a lot of sleep at times, knowing tomorrow I have to do something, right, and you just can't, stop thinking about it, right? When those wheels are turning, I think the thing I would do is just remind myself that there's nothing really to lose, and the temptation is to think about all the risk, but everybody in that room, that you're presenting to, they've all been there, right? Like, they've all had those moments where they've put it on the line, and they've been in front of the room. And if not all of them, certainly the ones that you're worried about, right, the most, right? The person who could fire you, or the customer who could, sideline you, right? They've been there, right? And they know what it's like to be nervous, and they're not going to hold that against you nearly as much as you think, right? And so I let that sort of eat at me at times, and if I could go back, I'd just say, everybody feels this, right? And unfortunately, that message doesn't always help, knowing that other people feel. It's like, how do I change that feeling for myself? And for that one, I wish I'd figured out a couple of my, things that didn't depend on the uniform, if you will, just a couple of those other tricks to kind of get my head in the right place. And the one I've never figured out is the night before. Like, how do you, get your head in the right place to just go to sleep, right? The best trick that I've come up with so far is find a good book to read, not a business book or whatever, but fiction, something just different. So at least you're thinking about something else, and then maybe your brain will relax enough to go to sleep. That's the best trick I've found. I don't know that it's a great one, but it's sometimes you lose an hour or two reading, but eventually it catches you. But I think in the moment, it's, how do you get in the right headspace, an hour before, 10 minutes before, whatever it is, that's something that, like, everyone can do. And it's really, there's great research and writing about that sort of stuff too, like about the way to prep. But I think it helps to hear that, from individual people, no, it works for me too, right? Like, I do that stuff, right? To Nathaniel's point about posture and doing something to get your head up out of the keyboard, right? And looking around and getting the energy up. It's so critical, right?
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I can't thank you both enough. I'm really getting a great education at the moment around this. I'm writing a series of blogs around it because it's not something that I've really suffered from. I've probably suffered from the opposite of it, actually, which is excuse me, which is also can be a problem, right? But I think I think normal people suffer from these things. Like there's a spectrum, right? And sometimes they might feel overconfident, sometimes they might feel underconfident, and it's kind of just catching yourself at that point and saying, well, is this reality, right? Like am I really amazing at that or not? Like, have I done something like it before? Like, if you haven't done anything like it before and you think you're really amazing at it, then probably you're gonna fall on your ass, right? But on the other side of things, if you have done it before and you think you're no good at it, probably you're going to be good at it, right? So, it's I think it's just a big reality check for people and keeping in tune with what skills you have and just accepting the fact that you've got to go through it, right? I mean, that's it really on my side of things.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, and I think you just also have to understand in the audience, right, or watching somebody operate as a leader, you don't really know what's going on in their head, right? And they could be an extrovert who loves this stuff, or an introvert who is pretending but doing a really good job pretending. And either way, it's okay, right? Like, you don't have to be one extreme or the other. And you can even be an introvert and love it. It doesn't mean you won't also have that feelings of inadequacy at times, right? Of like, I love it, but am I actually doing a good job? And every time I finish giving a talk or we do a, meeting with a client or whatever, it's always hard to judge your own performance, right? Because you're in it. It's always easier to help people understand their performance and how they did and give them coaching. It's very hard to coach yourself, right?
Yeah.
Maybe if you record and do replay, but otherwise it's very hard to do. And I think whether you're extroverted or introverted, right, it's finding someone who can give you a good critique or coaching, afterward is brilliant. It's hard to do in a business if you're the CEO because, people report to you, they might soften the blow a little bit. You might not hear the hard news you need to hear. But hopefully you have some folks on your team. My business partner, Lance, certainly would let me hear it straight. If I screwed up a presentation or was off message, he'd say, well, this part was great, but this other part, we need to talk, right? And it's important to have those voices, right? That can give you honest, unvarnished feedback when you need it. And at other times, just a boost, right?
Oh yeah, very much so. Well, thank you, Scott. And so if people want to learn more about your company, they can go to bp-3.com, right? And,
that's right.
And find out more about you, right? And they can find you on LinkedIn as well, and on Twitter, I think, as well. So I'll drop your links in. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for supporting our show. Please do share this episode with your friends and business associates, and click the link below to subscribe to the podcast. Until next time, take care.